All right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And as many of our long-standing teachers may know, February is a really special month for us. We spend the entire month only showcasing incredible women in science and exploration from across the globe. And this month, we're doing it bigger and better than ever. In addition to 35 plus live programs throughout the month, we also did our huge festival, February 12th through 14th. So if you didn't get a chance to see this, I'm going to bring it up on a banner here. Our Women Blaze Trails Festival had 50 programs, 50 in 3 days, featuring everything from astronauts to cave divers, deep sea explorers, people studying rhinos in the Serengeti. Really incredible slate of women. So do check out that website. All the YouTube links, all the programs are on our YouTube channel, so you can check them out as well. So today we are diving in and continuing a long-standing series with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Just yesterday, we were partnered with Carrie Underhill, who talked about some really cool work she was doing. And a lot of the questions for her centered around invasive species. People were really keen to know what Fisheries and Oceans Canada was doing to understand and, fight against invasive species. And so we couldn't have had a better into today's program. We are joined live by Dr. Rowshyra Castañeda. She is going to talk to us today about her work to understand and protect against invasive species and study and save endangered species all across Canada and freshwater ecosystems across the country. So I'm really excited to dive in. I hope you guys are as well. We've got kids from all over the world today. Really exciting to have you guys all in. And without further ado, Rowshyra, take us away. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. Is there an echo?
No.
Okay, perfect. I had a little bit of a feedback, so that's works out. So yeah, today I'll be talking to you about freshwater ecology in general, but specifically on endangered and invasive species. But before we get into the nitty-gritty science, I thought I'd just start off with a little slide about me and my career trajectory and how I became a freshwater ecologist. So yes, I'm a freshwater ecologist. I specialize in species at risk, so species that are at risk of extinction, specifically freshwater fishes and freshwater mussels. I also am an invasive species ecologist, so I study invasive freshwater fishes and freshwater invertebrates. Now, invertebrates are animals that don't have a backbone, so that includes insects, mollusks, so clams, mussels, etc. So I kind of study a whole bunch of different animals, but within the realms of species at risk and invasive species. Now, so this is me actually with a brown trout that we caught in a stream. I believe it was around Brampton, and brown trout are actually not native to Canada. They're from Europe. And so they're technically an invasive species, but they've been here for so long that they're just considered naturalized and part of our water bodies and water courses. And they're really beautiful. So a bit about me. I actually grew up in the city. I had very little connection with nature. I'm from Montreal, which is an island. So obviously it is surrounded by water, by the St. Lawrence River, which is a huge water body. But being in the city, I was never really connected to the water. There was a big port between me and the water. And so I didn't have that kind of upbringing that I feel a lot of ecologists that I interact with today, they grew up fishing or going to their cottage, canoeing, kayaking, and that wasn't something I ever was exposed to as a child, but I still became a freshwater ecologist. I grew up watching a lot of, National Geographic, BBC's nature documentaries. So I always thought I'd become more of a marine biologist or an archaeologist. But freshwater ecology wasn't something that I really knew much about. And this wasn't until I started my biology degree at McGill University. So I went into biology mostly because my parents, because I was always good at science, they wanted me to go into medicine or pharmacology or something more in the medical field. But I always had an interest in the environment. So being in biology, I realized that there's a subfield called ecology, which is actually the studies of organisms and how they interact with the environment, which was something that really interested me. And at McGill University, I was also able to do a minor in field studies, which actually gave me all the training that I needed to become a freshwater ecologist. So I didn't have any skills before going into university. I didn't camp. I didn't do much exploring. So this program allowed me to really understand how to study animals and the different types of ecosystems that these animals live in. So on the right, you can see that I actually went to East Africa for a semester. So here we are at our camp in Uganda, where there were a lot of baboons, so we were able to study a bit of their behavior. We also did a herpetology course where we studied snakes and frogs, so amphibians and reptiles in Kenya. I also got to go to Panama, and this is a picture of us counting bugs and all the diversity there is at the edge of a forest. And so this was really my introduction into field biology and field ecology. Now from here, because I was able to kind of dabble in all these different animals and ecosystems, I really fell in love with freshwater ecology after taking a freshwater ecology course at university. So for my master's degree, I studied an invasive clam. I always thought I would do, more tropical ecology, but I realized that we have this huge river, the St. Lawrence River, that is along the shores of Montreal. So I could really just study the organisms that are in my backyard that I never really thought about before starting my university degree. So I studied the invasive clam, Corbicula fluminea is a scientific name, so invasive clam, an Asian clam. And I also got to study microbeads. So I discovered microbeads in the St. Lawrence River while sampling for these invasive clams. And so that really solidified my love for science and discovery. So I wasn't even thinking about microbeads, and I was studying these clams. And as we were going through the samples, we discovered that, wow, there are all these microplastic beads. And that allowed me to explore a different side of freshwater ecology and more of the pollution. So from there, I did my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Toronto. So I figured I studied invertebrates, some clams, some pollution, but I had never really studied fishes. So I decided that that's what I wanted to do for my PhD. And I specifically was studying endangered species. So I went from invasive species to endangered species for my PhD. Specifically, I was focused on red-side dace, which is an endangered minnow in Ontario, and some redfins, which are endangered in South Africa. So I got to also do some field work abroad for my PhD. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Species at Risk Science program at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So really, I'm focusing on protecting and recovering species at risk of extinction. So that's about me. And so let's jump into the science part. So what is freshwater ecologist? I call myself a freshwater ecologist, but let's define what freshwater ecology is. So freshwater ecology is the study of all aquatic ecosystems, which range from lakes like Lake Huron here in Ontario, Canada, to wetlands where we have water bodies with a lot of submerged and emergent and floating vegetation. So like this wetland in Lake Erie in Ontario, Canada. It also includes the study of rivers. So this is the Little Rouge River in Ontario, Canada, which is about 20 minutes from Toronto. And it also includes ponds. So any kind of fresh water, so non-salted water body is included in freshwater ecology. And this is a pond we studied looking for an invasive fish called tench in the agricultural town of Ceres in South Africa. So the study of aquatic ecosystem includes many different things. You can study the water chemistry, the hydrology, so how the water is moving, and the physical processes of a freshwater water course or water body. You can study algae and plants. As you can see in this pond picture, there's lots of plants and different macrophytes that could be studied. Fishes, which is what I do, so salmons, minnows, carps, basses, sunfishes. You can also study invertebrates that I mentioned earlier, so the larval or nymph stage of insects. So there's mussels, clams, worms, and crustaceans, which all make an integral part of freshwater ecology. Now, what's fascinating to me about freshwater ecosystems is that they hold a tremendous amount of biodiversity. So when you look at a globe that's covered in 2/3 of oceans, so those are marine environments, whereas freshwater actually only comprises of about 0.01% of all water on Earth, but it's actually home to almost half of all fish diversity. So if you think of all the fish species you can think of, from the oceans to coral reefs to your lakes and rivers, fresh water, which only has 0.1% of all water on Earth, has almost half of all that fish diversity, which is amazing. And fishes in general provide many different ecosystem functions. So they provide food web structure, they cycle nutrients, they engineer habitats, which are all important to keep our water bodies clean and safe. And of course, that's really important for humans because we need water to drink, to water our crops, and for navigation. But of course, they are quite prone to degradation. So unfortunately, we are facing a biodiversity crisis in all ecosystems across the planet. So species are going extinct very quickly due to human activity, be it climate change, habitat destructions for agriculture, urbanization, pollution, and or invasive species. So just to give you an example, if you look at the screen on the right bottom, there's a boat, and it looks like it's just kind of sitting in a small pond on a big grassy field. That's actually a huge lake that's covered with water hyacinth, which is an invasive species. So that whole green area is supposed to be water, but it's actually been invaded by water hyacinth that's covering the whole surface of the lake, which you can imagine has negative impacts for the species that are living below the surface. You know, there's no more access to light. There's probably less oxygen because all of these water hyacinths are using up the oxygen in the water. So there could be a lot of negative consequences of invasive species on our freshwater ecosystems. And just the other day, actually yesterday, this news article came up on BBC where saying that extinction, so freshwater fish are in catastrophic decline. So a lot of people argue that proportionally rates of decline in freshwater biodiversity are greater than in the terrestrial ecosystems. Now I'm talking a lot about a species at risk and imperiled species. So I just wanted to give you a little definition and give you some context, a Canadian context to species at risk. So a species at risk or an imperiled species is a species that is at risk of extinction, so no longer existing on Earth. In Canada, there are about 75 freshwater fish species and about 20 freshwater mussel species that are registered under the Species at Risk Act. Now, the Species at Risk Act is a legislation in Canada that once a species is put under this act or registered under this act, they need to be protected and recovered so that we can actually keep all of our biodiversity in our country, to increase and keep our biodiversity. Now, conservation and recovery of these species is a priority of the Species at Risk Science program that I work for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Now, I've also talked a lot about invasive species, so I just want to give a bit of context for what is an invasive species. So an invasive species is a species introduced to an area beyond the range where it has evolved. So a species that comes to a new place that it's never been to before, it grows in population size, takes over and kind of has some impacts. Now, there are different types of negative impacts that invasive species can have on native communities. So for example, they can predate or feed on native species. So the bottom left, the Nile perch, is an invasive species in Lake Victoria in Africa. And this species is known to predate on the smaller fishes called these small cichlids, which has accelerated the extinction of many of these cichlid species. Now, these cichlid species were already in decline because of habitat degradation, but the Nile perch really helped to make them extinct because they were feeding so much on these small cichlids. Invasive species can also outcompete native species for space and food. So an example of this is the middle picture. So if any of you are in Ontario or Quebec, you might have seen zebra mussels in Lake Ontario, along docks or on the sand, some shells. Maybe you might have cut your foot on one because they are quite sharp. But these zebra mussels are from the Black and Caspian area of Europe, and they've come to Canada through ships. So shipping brought them over by accident. And these zebra mussels like to attach to things. And so in this picture, you can see that a bunch of zebra mussels attached to a native mussel called a unionid and is using their shell and taking up all that space, preventing this unionid mussel from feeding. So it can outcompete and kill native species in different ways. Invasive species can also alter habitat for native species. So the picture on the right is a goldfish that's about 30 centimeters, so a whole ruler, or about 12 inches in length, which is huge when you think about your pet goldfish that are pretty much about, 5 centimeters probably max. So goldfish are notorious invasive species. So a lot of people tend to release their pet fish if they don't want. You shouldn't do that because goldfish love to stir up the sediment, pull up macrophytes, which makes the water very dark and turbid, so not very clear, which can affect the native species that are living there. And they eat so much food that they get so huge. Now, a way to reduce the amount of impacts an invasive species might have is to first prevent them from coming into a new ecosystem. And so this is the invasion curve for some of you who might be more visually inclined to graphs. But as you can see on the left side is the area infested. On the bottom, on the x-axis, is time. So as you leave things to invade for a longer amount of time, the more area is being infested by an invasive species and the harder it is to control them. So the best thing to do to control invasive species, I don't think I can use my mouse, is to really try to stop them at the introduction phase, where you can see the blue arrow at the bottom left of this graph. So you want to prevent them from coming in, which is what the Asian carp program of Fisheries and Oceans Canada is doing. They're making sure that no Asian carp are coming into the Lake Ontario or our Great Lakes, and because they can have devastating effects to our fisheries. And to do that, this prevention, there's a lot of monitoring that happens in our water bodies to make sure that there are no Asian carp. But that takes a lot of effort. There's a lot of people, Fisheries and Oceans, out fishing for fish, making sure that they aren't catching anything. And if a fisherman or fisher person, happens to catch a type of Asian carp, so a grass carp, silver carp, black carp, big head carp, and I forget the last one. If they catch one of those, then Fisheries and Oceans Canada sends out a team to the area where the carp was caught, and then they do a lot of fishing and surveying to make sure there aren't any more. So there is an immediate response to the detection of an invasive species. And so what's key about this is early detection. So in this red box, that's where we want to focus our energy and resources on. So early detection of freshwater fishes is usually done using some conventional sampling methods. So there's backpack electrofishing or boat electrofishing. So that's the first picture on the left, where you can see that there's a person in the middle with a wand, and they're sending out some small electrical currents into the water to kind of stun the fish so that we can catch them. So it kind of stops them from swimming away. Usually it doesn't harm the fish, but sometimes it can. But we try to be really careful and not cause any harm. But you can imagine if you're getting a little zap, it's probably not that comfortable. There's also seine netting, as you can see in the middle picture, where we pull a big net across a water body and then we collect all the fishes. And then there's a passive type of sampling called fyke netting, where we put out a net across a certain area. We leave it overnight, so we allow the fish to passively swim into it. And the next morning, we collect the fyke nets, we pour it into a bucket, and we count and identify all these fishes. Now, one similar thing across all of these conventional sampling methods is that we have to physically handle the fishes. And this can increase stress and potentially, there's potential mortality to these fishes if we're handling them, or if they get stuck in a seine net and there's a rock that might have hit it by accident. It could also be a bit disruptive to the ecosystem because we're walking through and pulling nets, so we're like disturbing the sediment. So what I did for my PhD, because I was working on imperiled fishes, we have to also monitor these a lot to make sure that they aren't in decline, that we're not losing population in different water bodies. But then we have to decide between monitoring and early detection and the potential sampling harm, which could be bad for a species that's already at risk of extinction. So my thesis was trying to develop non-harmful sampling methods for these rare species or these species at risk. And so I was developing the use of underwater cameras, I used snorkel surveys, and we did environmental DNA, which is a technique where you go out, you collect water sample, you bring it back to the lab after you filter it, and then you look for the DNA that's in these water samples to identify which fish species are present. This is great. These sampling methods allows for the study of rare cryptic species, allows you to understand the community composition, so how many fishes are in an environment, the behavior of fish for at least the visual methods, population abundances, so how many of each species are present, and it's an ethical method to use. So my question was, can we use underwater cameras to detect rare freshwater fishes? So to do this work, I specifically worked on a rare fish in Ontario, red-side dace, Clinostomus elongatus. It's a stream-dwelling cold water minnow, but it's experienced over 50% decline in populations over the past 10 years. And this is because this fish mostly resides in the Greater Toronto area, which is highly urbanized and keeps being developed for more housing. It's listed as endangered by the Species at Risk Act and the Ontario Endangered Species Act. And this is often a minnow that's associated with common minnow species, but it's much rarer. So then to answer this question, can we use underwater cameras? I had to do some field work. So I went out, put some GoPro cameras. We wanted to make sure that this method was accessible to everyone who wanted to use it, including you. If you're interested, you can go out and put out a GoPro, an underwater camera, to see what's living underwater in any stream in your backyard. These cameras are not to scale. They're not that big. They don't take up the width of the river, but this is just a visualization. And then we followed up with those conventional sampling methods that I mentioned. So we did backpack electrofishing and seining. And then we also took a whole bunch of different habitat variables to understand which habitat variables could be affecting our ability to detect these rare fishes. Then we're back into the lab and we do some video analysis. So this is one example of a video I took of a stream in the Greater Toronto area. And you can see it could be really difficult to see and identify these fishes. These fish are also moving very, very quickly. It's very turbid. It's a more polluted environment. So this proved to be a bit difficult. But nevertheless, we do see some red-side dace. You see one shooting across the screen now, which is great. That means we can identify this rare species. And we can also study species interactions using these underwater videos. This one's a clear stream. This one's in more of an agricultural protected area. And as you can see, the red-side dace here swimming across, but it's also in the school of much different minnows. We have a white sucker here, a creek chub, so we can see how these different species are interacting amongst each other, which could be important so that we know that when we're restoring an area or reintroducing red-side dace to a new stream, that maybe we want to make sure that these other fishes that they're interacting with are present. Sorry. It's not moving. Let me pause this video and see if I can switch. There we go. We could also study the behavior of these fishes. So red-side dace here is swimming around, and you can see that it's feeding on a bunch of different stuff in the water column. So we can also study how it feeds, what it's feeding on. So it just chewed up on some detritus here. And so that gives us more of an idea of how and where red-side dace is inhabiting. Now, this was all work done in Ontario, and we want to know, can we do the same thing in a different environment? So I went to South Africa and we did some studies in headwater streams in protected areas. So these are areas with no pollution, no urbanization, pristine, beautiful areas, except for the fact that they have invasive fishes. So in this case, smallmouth bass smallmouth bass that are actually going upstream and eating the native species. So in this case, in South Africa, you can see that the water is so clear, it's so easy to identify these fishes. We have here the Cape redfin, and earlier we saw a Sendelia capensis, which is this fish here, which is the Cape kerper, and those were the fishes we were studying. So even in rivers across the country, across 2 different countries, the videos can be so different, and our ability to detect and identify these species varies. But I want to know, what is the difference between underwater cameras with eDNA and snorkel surveys? So all three non-harmful methods. So we went out to the field, we collected all this data. We also took some habitat measurements so that we can understand how habitat affects these methods. And then after a bunch of data analysis, a lot of statistics and models that are being run on computers and coding, our main conclusions were, yes, we can use underwater cameras to detect fishes as well as conventional sampling methods and other non-harmful methods. But that's the short answer. Of course, as you saw, some videos were very turbid, so it makes it much harder to identify. So there are limits of when and how we can use underwater cameras to detect species at risk and also invasive species, because when they're early in introduction, they're also considered rare because there aren't very many of them. So what are the conservation implications of using underwater cameras? Well, we can use them for monitoring imperiled and endangered fishes, which can be done more regularly. So we can put cameras in more often instead of physically sampling them all the time and increasing stress of a population. We can safely and more readily identify habitats to conserve and restore. So by analyzing these videos, we can understand what types of environments, what interactions different species need to survive and repopulate an area. We could also quickly identify invasive fishes to contain them and then hopefully eradicate them to minimize their impact on native communities. So in general, I would say underwater cameras are great for aiding in the protection of our freshwater ecosystems, but a lot more work has to be done to be able to use this tool effectively. And that's all I have to say for today. And just these are funding and co-authors for all these projects. And I'd love to get any questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Castañeda. If you want to come out of screen share so we can have a bit of a conversation, that would be great.
Absolutely.
We've got over 250 kids tuning in. We've got at least 10 schools in Massachusetts, Virginia, Alabama, across Ontario and beyond Virginia. So welcome into all of you guys. Thank you so much for joining. That was a really fantastic talk. So yeah, let's dive in with questions. If you're on YouTube, please type in the chat bar. We'll take as many as we can from there. But I am going to start us off today with Miss Norton's class. So Miss Norton's class is joining us in Grafton, Massachusetts. If you have a question for us, come on in.
Hi. Well, I will have to say my students have been chatting up over here, so thank you for that presentation.
That's great.
I have quite a few. I'm just going to pick kind of the first couple. So
Sounds great.
some of my fantastic students that are very big smiles right now are wondering kind of what's the most dangerous evasive species you feel as though you've studied.
That I've studied specifically? Dangerous, I guess. Define dangerous. Dangerous for an ecosystem, dangerous for humans, dangerous for our economy. So I study the Asian clam, which tends to, it doesn't, bite anything, but it filters water really quickly. So it removes a lot of nutrients from an area, which can increase water clarity, which can change the ecosystem completely. But they grow really fast and reproduce really quickly. And they tend to infest power plants because it's warmer water. The Asian clam tends to be a more tropical species. So they tend to live where there's warmer waters. And the amount of fouling that these clams have caused is almost like billions of dollars a year to clean and maintain power plants, which are important for humans to have energy and for our economy. And dangerous to, well, silver carp are kind of funny in the Mississippi River. If you're out boating, they get scared, they jump out of the water and smack people in the face, which can give them concussions or hurt them. So that's a different type of dangerous, other than their ecosystem impacts as well.
That is one of the first times you've ever referenced fish coming out and giving people concussions in the history of this program.
There's YouTube videos if you want to check them out.
There is. I was going to say, people can really easily find that. I've seen that footage. I want to stress before we go to our next teacher too, you mentioned something called environmental DNA, and I want every class, when you're done this, go look up environmental DNA, because it is absolutely mind-blowing that we can do this as a technology in the world. It's like one of the coolest things ever in biology. So very, very cool stuff. Ms. Norton, I will come back to you for a second question in a bit. We're just going to do one round for everybody. So Mr. Second-year's class is grade 7s. They're joining us in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Welcome in, Mr. Second-year, and take us away.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for this
Hi.
opportunity. And thank you for your amazing presentation. Is there an ability to farm raise these native species that are endangered to support rebuilding their numbers?
Yeah, so that is actually something that Fisheries and Oceans, our Species at Risk program, is very interested in doing. They funded some labs in Canada, in Ontario, that are actually breeding, so captive breeding, at least red-side dace, and I think lake chubsucker, to eventually reintroduce them into water bodies that have been restored. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. We want to make sure that the population that's being reintroduced into a water body is the correct genotype, because there are differences sometimes in populations, that they would be able to adapt to their new environment, that there's no disease transfer. But yes, absolutely, there are captive breeding programs happening. I know that's much more popular for salmon. So salmonids, this is something that happens a lot, where they raise, or they collect eggs and then they imprint them into streams so that they could repopulate a stream. But it hasn't been done too much for minnows and other non-commercially important species, and they're also doing it for freshwater mussels. But that's still kind of early stages, but it's definitely something that we're working on.
Cool question, guys. Let's head to Ms. Moore's class, joining us in Newmarket, Alabama. Always nice to have Alabama groups. You guys are like the most enthusiastic kids in the world, I think. But yeah, come on in. You're good to go. Welcome in, everyone. Hi.
Hi.
I told you. There you go. Share away.
We're here. So we do have in-person students. And one of my students, Ben, wants to know if you have studied any freshwater sharks, and tell us a little about your studies if you studied them. If not, what is probably the most dangerous species that you have studied? Well, I mean, sorry, I know that is what the other lady asked, but dangerous as far as like violent, I guess. Is
Okay,
what they,
yeah. So there aren't really any freshwater sharks. The bull shark is known to be able to go up rivers. So I think that's a thing in Australia and maybe Florida, where they are marine sharks and they can tolerate freshwater environments. So they can get into rivers where there's less salt. So I've never studied freshwater sharks or sharks in general, but I did go cage diving with great white sharks when I was in South Africa, which was amazing. I didn't study them, but I definitely, and I've done some diving in Colombia and Panama with sharks, but no actual studying of them, just enjoying them as a tourist. And then the most dangerous animal or fish or mussel fish that I've studied, all the fish that I've studied have been pretty docile. When I was snorkeling in South Africa, there was a little water beetle that bit me when I was snorkeling, and that wasn't very pleasant. It was like a wasp bite. But the areas where have had dangerous animals, so I've come face to face with a Cape cobra in South Africa, where I had to freeze and not move for a little bit. Green mamba as well on my balcony in Kenya. We had a Cape leopard on our site in Ceres, South Africa. So I've encountered dangerous animals, but not studied them.
I can see why you came to Canada. Very rare to have a green mamba on your balcony in Toronto. It's almost impossible. I'm going to take a few quick questions from YouTube, and then we'll go back to our live class.
Sounds great.
To wrap up the first round. So Mr. Dixon's class, they're joining us in Cornwall, Ontario. He wants to know, how do ballasts work in regard to spreading invasive species, which is a really cool question.
That's a great question. So first, to define what ballast is. So ballast is water that's uptaken by a ship to weigh it down. So if a cargo ship doesn't have a lot of cargo and it's too light, it won't safely go across an ocean. So we have to weigh it down. So what happens is they have tanks at the bottom of the ship, and they fill it up with water to make sure that the correct weight for buoyancy and safe passage. So if you're in a dock in, say, England, or at least the Black Sea, so this is before there was regulations on how to safely eject your ballast water, so before 2006. So from, let's say, the Black Sea, which is brackish water, so a bit salty but not too salty, a lot of this water would be sucked into these tanks. And a lot of times there's no filters. Most of the time there's no filter to make sure that there's no animals going into these water tanks. And so it would suck up zebra mussels or goby or freshwater shrimp into these ballast tanks. And then these are very tolerant species. So invasive species also tend to be very tolerant because they're able to survive these big voyages across the ocean. And then when you got to a port, you would unload, reload, and then once you're reloaded, you're too heavy, so they have to pump out that water from the ballast tanks so that it can be the right weight for buoyancy. And as they pump out that water, all those organisms that were in the tanks that survived the ocean travel are now being pushed into our lakes. And so with enough of them or enough times that this happens, so more propagule pressure, which is what that's called, the number of times that a species is introduced into an area, they can actually start to establish, reproduce, and spread from there. So that's how ballast water at least can facilitate invasions. There's also a lot of animals that can stick to the hulls, so the actual structure of a ship, and if they can stick to that and survive a voyage, then they can be released into a new water body. And so that's how ballast contributes to invasive species spread.
I'm really glad we got that question. It's one that I was going to ask myself if we didn't get it from a teacher. So thank you to Mr. Dixon for passing that along. One quick one from YouTube, and then we'll go to Ms. Tangolis' class in a minute. So Sierra in Mr. Shattuck's grade 8 class, Chalk River, Ontario, wants to know, what's your favorite species of fish? What's the best fish?
So I do have a special place in my heart for red-side dace. It is endangered and it is declining, but I studied it a lot for my PhD. And what I think is fascinating about red-side dace is that it's one of the only minnow species, if not the only minnow species in Canada, that actually jumps out of the water a few, like maybe a foot in the air to catch terrestrial insects to feed, which is so cool. And that's why they have those big mouths. So they jump out of the water, they feed on these terrestrial insects, and then are able to go about their lives. I think they're really beautiful too. They have a nice red stripe with a gold stripe on top. So I am partial to red-side dace. I also really love long-nosed dace. So it's a little fish that lives at the bottom of rivers, and they have these really goofy noses. And when they're in spawning colors, their fins turn like a bright orange, and their lips and nose turn really bright orange or red. So they're just kind of look like goofy clowns. So those are the two fish I like.
Goofy clowns is a good reason to like anything.
Yeah.
Let's head back to our live classes. So Ms. Stengols' class, joining us in Toronto. If you want to come on in, go for it.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
Thank you for presenting and speaking with us today. One of my students, Khalid, would like to know if an invasive species can ever be helpful in a habitat.
So yeah, so of course, it depends helpful for who. So this is the big thing in invasion biology, is that impacts are defined differently for different stakeholders. So maybe not so much in the water, like in freshwater ecosystems, but sometimes there are, I think there was an example in Australia where there was a specific plant that was really helpful for farmers. It made the soil much better, but it outcompeted some native plants that were around. So the botanists and the conservation biologists don't like this plant because they feel they have negative impacts on the native communities. But farmers really like to have this invasive plant around because it facilitated their agriculture. So it really depends on who you ask, whether or not an invasive species is good or bad. As a conservation biologist, studying endangered species, there's so many endangered species, we're losing biodiversity at accelerated rates. I'd rather keep invasive species out of native ecosystems. Of course, some, invasive species barely have a noticeable impact at all and can go unnoticed for years, and they just become part of our ecosystems. You said you were from Toronto. So actually in Lake Ontario, the provincial government stocks Lake Ontario with Chinook and coho salmon, which are actually not native to Ontario. They're native from British Columbia, and that was to replace the extinction of Atlantic salmon to try to feed on alewife, which is also an invasive species. So we're using invasive species or naturalized now to continue those ecosystem functions. So I guess in a sense that would have a positive impact on an environment. And if you ever go out to the Don River or Humber River in the fall, you can see those salmon are actually running upstream to spawn. So I really highly recommend that if you're in the area.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I've been in Toronto my whole life, and I only discovered this 2 years ago, and watching salmon run up the rivers is amazing.
It's so cool.
PTA classes, do check that out. It's a really amazing thing to see. We've got time for 2 more questions. I wish we had time for lots more, but I do have a way that our classes that won't get more have a way to ask more, so we'll get to that in a minute. But I want to share Mr. Dunn's group joining us in Sudbury. Mr. Dunn, if you want to come on in for a question, go for it.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for that great presentation. I had a lot of great questions, but I'm going to focus on Elaine's. Now, you talked about Atlantic salmon going extinct. She wanted to know if there was any other fish or any other organisms that may have become extinct in our Great Lakes system.
Yes.
And if so, what was the primary reason?
So Atlantic salmon went extinct in Lake Ontario because of overfishing and agriculture and damming in the 1800s. So we haven't seen an Atlantic salmon or a native Atlantic salmon since, I think, 1869. But there's lots of programs trying to reintroduce Atlantic salmon. So if you do see Atlantic salmon in our rivers or lakes here in Ontario, it was one that was bred captively and then released. We've also had extinction of Cisco species, which are a type of, I guess, whitefish, a salmonid. I don't want to say anything too wrong, but I want to generalize as well. And these are different. These are fish that used to be fished a lot. They still are fished, but there's different morphs or types of those Ciscos that have gone extinct from homogenization, so invasive species. And habitat destruction, like just pollution in general, and overfishing. There's so much overfishing that's been done in our Great Lakes, and we've had a lot of extirpations of species.
On a positive note, certainly when I was a kid, the Great Lakes weren't even I never heard about the Great Lakes as a place filled with wildlife. That just wasn't a thing that was talked about. And nowadays that's increasingly changing. National Geographic's done some really fantastic articles lately on the Great Lakes as a major ecosystem. I mean, these are one of the largest bodies of water on the planet, with millions of people living in and on them. I mean, we've got tons of classes today that are on the coast of the Great Lakes. And so it's so important to protect these species. There's so much work that's being done by amazing people like Dr. Castañeda. So it's nice to get a chance to highlight some of this for our classes today. All right, we've got time for one more question. And what I'm going to do is, before I take this, I'm going to share, just bring this up on the screen, your website. So we have way more questions than we could possibly answer. There's 100 questions in the chat.
That's so exciting.
So if you guys want to harass Dr. Castañeda and just send her a bajillion questions, go to her website, learn more about what she does, and do that, and make her regret ever joining us for Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants.
I love answering questions.
Perfect. Okay, I take it back. Send the questions away. But what I want to do now is take one last one from Miss Stubbs' class. They're joining us in Guelph, they're grade 11s, and their question is, have we had any success controlling invasive species? We've been talking about a lot of these threats, these big problems. Is there any real success story that we can point to?
I would say no.
Okay.
Well, at least for aquatic. I think so we've had the longhorn beetle, which used to be, I think, obviously it's still a problem, but we've had a lot of management that was successful. So not moving firewood, making sure wood is treated to make sure that the longhorn beetle, the Asian longhorn beetle, doesn't transfer between areas, and because it consumes a lot of the wood. Emerald ash borer is still a huge problem in Ontario and, well, Canada in general. It's reduced, I think, ash trees up to 60% in areas. In the aquatic ecosystems, we've had very little success in reducing impacts of invasive species. Really, invasive species really came onto the radar in the Great Lakes in the 90s when zebra mussels and round goby were found, and they were showing demonstrable impacts on our ecosystems. So, we've only really been studying this for the past 20 and 30 years and trying to understand the context dependence. So, the same invasive species can have big impacts in one areas and less in the others. So really getting at that fundamental science as to why impacts are different in different areas. And now we're really getting into the management. I think the Asian Carp program of Fisheries and Oceans Canada has been doing a fantastic job at monitoring and making sure that none of the Asian carp species get into our water bodies. So I would say that program is a success because we've managed to keep the Asian carp species out for the past 6 or 7 years, which is amazing. But generally, we're fairly slow at managing and reducing invasive species. A study I did in South Africa, actually, in a small stream where there were endangered freshwater endemic, so only in that region those fishes existed. There were smallmouth bass and largemouth bass and tilapia and bluegill that were invasive to the area, and they actually eradicated it using a chemical called rotenone, which is a fish poison. And it's been really successful. The fish have jumped back, the native endemic fish, their numbers are increasing, they're stable. So there are case studies of good invasive species management, but they're few and far between.
Yeah. And I think that, it's a distressing thing to highlight that, but I think it's really important to note that it's really important to make sure that invasive species don't get in places in the first place.
Exactly.
We're seeing this around the world, Australia and Hawaii, for people who may have visited those places or live there. They're some of the most intense quarantine measures in the world for making sure that new things don't come there. One thing that's really small that you guys can do if you ever go on vacation anywhere, if you have boots and you're going to go hiking, wash those boots before you go so you don't carry parasites or fungi that can infect a new ecosystem in a new way. Just a small note, but something very easy that we can all do before we travel anywhere different.
And don't release your fish.
Don't release your fish. If you have something and you want to get rid of a pet, there are ways to do that.
They've actually found piranha.
Yeah.
In Lake Ontario. I mean, they don't survive the winter, but people do, fish get too big, people can't, and they just think dumping them is a good idea, but it's not.
No piranha in Lake Ontario. All our classes, don't do that if you have pet piranhas at home, or crocodiles or snakes or anything. Dr. Castañeda, this has been so much fun. As you can tell, the class has absolutely loved it. So a huge thank you to you, to all our groups for joining in today. And again, if people want to ask more questions of you, they can check out your website below. What we do at the end of every broadcast, I know we've only got one live group with the kids in class today, but I'm going to bring in all our teachers. So Ms. Norton, Mr. Dunn, Ms. Stangolis, Mr. Seginger, and Ms. Moore's class. If you want to join me in saying a big thank you and goodbye to Dr. Castañeda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.